My name is Evangeline Morningstar, and I'm 78 years old now. People always tell me I look younger, maybe 65 on a good day, but the mirror doesn't lie about the silver in my hair or the lines around my eyes that tell stories of both joy and heartbreak. What I'm about to tell you happened when I was 60, recently widowed, and foolish enough to believe in fairy tales one more time. I had been married to my beloved Harold for 38 years when cancer took him from me. Harold was my everything, my high school sweetheart, the father of my 3 children, and my partner through every season of life. When he passed, I thought my story was over. I thought I'd spend the rest of my days tending to his garden, visiting his grave, and waiting for my time to join him. But life, as I've learned, has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. It was a Tuesday morning in September when I first met Alejandro. I remember because Tuesdays were when I volunteered at the Riverside Community Center, serving lunch to anyone who needed a warm meal. The autumn leaves were just beginning to turn, painting the world in shades of gold and crimson that reminded me of Harold's favorite season. Alejandro walked into that community center like he owned the place, but not in an arrogant way. He moved with quiet confidence, his dark eyes scanning the room until they landed on me behind the serving counter. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with thick black hair that curled slightly at the edges and skin that spoke of hours spent in the sun. When he smiled at me, something inside my chest fluttered in a way I hadn't felt in years. "Good afternoon, Senora," he said, his voice carrying just a hint of an accent that made my knees weak. I heard this was the place for the best home cooking in town. I felt my cheeks warm as I ladled meatloaf and mashed potatoes onto his plate. "Well, I can't promise it's the best, but it's made with love," I replied, immediately feeling foolish for such a cliché response. "Love is the most important ingredient," he said, and when our fingers brushed as I handed him the plate, I felt electricity shoot up my arm. That should have been the end of it. A pleasant encounter with a handsome stranger. But Alejandro didn't just take his meal and leave. He sat at the table closest to the serving counter and spent the entire lunch period trying to catch my eye. Every time I looked his way, he'd flash that devastating smile that made me feel like a schoolgirl again. When lunch service ended and I was cleaning up, he approached me with his empty plate. "Thank you for the wonderful meal," he said. "I'm new to town and I was wondering, would you perhaps show me around sometime? I'd love to see the area through the eyes of someone who clearly knows it well." I should have said no. I should have politely declined and gone home to water Harold's roses. Instead, I found myself nodding and writing my phone number on a napkin with shaking hands. "I'm Evangeline," I managed to say. "Alejandro," he replied, taking the napkin and folding it carefully into his wallet. Evangeline. A beautiful name for a beautiful woman. That night, I stared at my reflection in Harold's mirror, our mirror, and wondered what I was doing. At 60, with grown children and grandchildren, was I really entertaining the attention of a man who couldn't be much older than my youngest son, Marcus? But when Alejandro called the next evening, his warm voice chasing away the loneliness that had become my constant companion, I found myself saying yes to dinner. Our first date was at Romano's, a small Italian restaurant downtown where Harold and I had celebrated our anniversary every year. I almost canceled 3 times, but something kept me from picking up the phone. When I saw Alejandro waiting for me outside the restaurant, dressed in a crisp white shirt and dark slacks that hugged his athletic frame, I was glad I hadn't. "You look absolutely stunning," he said, offering me his arm. And for the first time in 2 years, I felt beautiful again. Over candlelight and wine, Alejandro told me about his life. He was 25, originally from Madrid, and had come to America to start fresh after a difficult breakup. He was working construction while taking night classes in business management, dreaming of opening his own landscaping company someday. "I've always been drawn to older women," he admitted, reaching across the table to take my hand. "They have wisdom, grace, and a depth that women my age simply don't possess." "You fascinate me, Evangeline." I should have been suspicious. I should have wondered why a handsome 25-year-old would be interested in a widow with crow's feet and age spots. But I was lonely, and he made me feel alive in a way I'd forgotten was possible. The months that followed were like a dream. Alejandro courted me with old-fashioned romance, flowers delivered to my door, handwritten letters left on my windshield, surprise picnics in the park where Harold and I used to walk. He listened to my stories about my children and grandchildren, my life with Harold, my fears about growing old alone. He held me when I cried and made me laugh when I thought I'd forgotten how. My children were horrified, of course. My eldest daughter, Patricia, staged what could only be called an intervention. "Mom, this is insane," she said, pacing around my living room like a caged animal. "He's younger than I am. What could he possibly want with you?" "Maybe he wants companionship," I replied, though even I could hear the uncertainty in my voice. "Companionship?" My son Robert laughed bitterly. "Mom, wake up. Men like that don't want companionship from women our age. He wants something, and I guarantee it's not your sparkling personality." Their words stung, because part of me wondered the same thing. But when Alejandro showed up at my door that evening with takeout from my favorite Chinese restaurant and spent 3 hours helping me organize Harold's old photographs, those doubts melted away. "Your children love you," he said as we sat on the couch, a box of memories between us. "They're just protective. They'll come around when they see how happy you make me." It was the first time he'd said I made him happy, rather than the other way around. Something about that felt significant, though I couldn't put my finger on why. 6 months into our relationship, Alejandro proposed. Not with a grand gesture or expensive ring, but quietly, as we sat on my back porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. "Marry me, Evangeline," he whispered, his arm tightening around my shoulders. "I know it's crazy, I know people will talk, but I can't imagine my life without you. You've made me believe in love again." I said yes before I could stop myself, tears streaming down my face as he slipped a simple gold band onto my finger. It wasn't Harold's ring. Nothing could replace that, but it was beautiful in its own way. We were married 3 months later in a small ceremony at the courthouse. Only my youngest son Marcus attended, though I could see the worry in his eyes even as he walked me down the aisle. Patricia and Robert stayed away, and their absence left a hole in my heart that even Alejandro's gentle kisses couldn't fill. "They'll come around," Alejandro assured me as we signed the marriage certificate. Love always wins in the end. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. Because the alternative, that I'd made a terrible mistake, was too frightening to consider. The first few months of marriage were blissful. Alejandro moved into my house, the one Harold and I had bought when we were newlyweds and had filled with decades of memories. He was respectful of Harold's things, never asking me to put away photographs or change anything that might cause me pain. He was attentive and affectionate, bringing me coffee in bed every morning and rubbing my feet every evening while we watched television. He helped with the yard work and household repairs, things that had become difficult for me to manage alone. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. It started with small suggestions. "Maybe we should get a joint checking account," he'd say casually over breakfast. "It would make things easier, don't you think?" Or, "Your friend Dorothy seems a little negative. Maybe you shouldn't spend so much time with her." Or, "Do you really need to drive to the store by yourself? I worry about you on these busy roads." Each suggestion seemed reasonable, even caring. A joint account would be more convenient. Dorothy could be negative sometimes. The roads were getting more crowded and dangerous. But looking back now, I can see how he was slowly, methodically isolating me from my support system and gaining control over my life. At the time, though, I was still drunk on the romance of it all, still amazed that this beautiful young man had chosen me. The first red flag I couldn't ignore came 4 months after our wedding. I was looking for my reading glasses and decided to check Alejandro's nightstand, thinking I might have left them there. Instead, I found a folder tucked behind his alarm clock. Inside were papers I didn't understand at first, documents with my name on them, financial statements, and what looked like property assessments. My heart began to race as I realized what I was looking at. Detailed information about my assets, my late husband's life insurance policy, the value of my home, even my monthly Social Security payments. When I confronted Alejandro that evening, He had a perfectly reasonable explanation ready. "Mi amor, I was planning to surprise you," he said, pulling me into his arms. "I've been looking into our financial future, maybe refinancing the house to get a better rate, or investing some of your savings to help them grow. I want to take care of you, to make sure you're secure in your retirement." It sounded logical. It sounded loving. But something in his eyes when he thought I wasn't looking told a different story. Something cold and calculating that made my blood run cold. That night, as Alejandro slept beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and remembering Harold's words from years ago. "Evie, if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. Trust your instincts. They've never steered you wrong." My instincts were screaming now, but I was afraid to listen. Afraid of being alone again. Afraid of admitting I'd made a mistake that my children had warned me about. Afraid of facing the truth that was slowly, terrifyingly becoming clear. But fear, I was about to learn, can be either a prison or a teacher. And Alejandro was about to give me the education of a lifetime. If this story is capturing your heart and making you want to know what happens next, hit that like button and subscribe. Evangeline's journey is just beginning, and trust me, you won't believe what she discovers about Alejandro's true intentions. Ring that notification bell so you don't miss a single thing in this incredible story. The morning after I found those papers, I decided to test my suspicions. I've always been good at reading people. It's a skill you develop after 60 years of life, and something about Alejandro's explanation didn't sit right with me. So I did what any sensible woman would do. I started paying closer attention. It began with small things. How Alejandro's accent seemed to come and go depending on his mood. How he claimed to be from Madrid but pronounced certain Spanish words in a way that didn't match the region. How he always seemed to know exactly what to say to calm my fears or redirect my attention when I asked uncomfortable questions. I started keeping a mental list of these inconsistencies, the way my late husband, Harold, used to keep track of his investments. Harold always said that patterns told the truth, even when people lied. 3 weeks after the folder incident, I made a discovery that shook me to my core. I was doing laundry when I found a cell phone in Alejandro's jeans pocket. Not his regular phone, but a second device I'd never seen before. My hands trembled as I powered it on, not sure what I expected to find, but knowing I had to look. The phone opened to a group chat called The Golden Game. The participants were listed only by initials, but the messages made my blood run cold. Yar. Phase 1 complete. Wedding done. Trust established. Moving to Phase 2. MK, how's the old bird? Still buying your caring husband act. AR. Hook, line, and sinker. She's putty in my hands. Give me 6 more months, and the house will be in my name. JS. Remember what happened to Carlos when he got greedy. Take your time, milk it properly. AR. This one's different. She's lonely, desperate. Has 3 kids, but they hate me, so no real support system. Perfect target. I dropped the phone like it was on fire, my whole body shaking with rage and humiliation. The man I'd married, the man I'd given my heart to, had been playing me from the very beginning. I was nothing more than a mark in some kind of elaborate con game. But the worst part was the next message I saw when I picked up the phone with trembling hands. AR. The best part? She actually thinks I love her. These lonely old widows are all the same. So grateful for attention they'll believe anything. I sat on my bedroom floor and cried until I had no tears left. Not just for myself, but for the version of me that had been brave enough to love again, only to discover it was all an illusion. When Alejandro came home that evening, whistling and carrying a bouquet of daisies, my favorite flowers, which he'd somehow known from our very first conversation, I almost confronted him. The words were right there on my tongue, burning to be spoken. But something stopped me. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the strategic mind I'd inherited from my businessman father. Instead of exploding, I decided to play his game better than he was playing it. "Hello, darling," I said, accepting his kiss on the cheek as if nothing had changed. "How was your day?" "Better now that I'm home with you," he replied smoothly, and I marveled at how convincing he sounded. If I hadn't seen those messages, I would have believed every word. That night, I began my own investigation. While Alejandro showered, I photographed every message on his secret phone. While he slept, I went through his things with the precision of a detective, looking for any clue about who he really was and what he was planning. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Hidden in his workout bag was a notebook filled with detailed information about me, not just my financial assets, but personal details that made my skin crawl. He knew about the scar on my left hip from when I fell off my bike as a child. He knew that I kept Harold's cologne in my nightstand drawer and sometimes sprayed it on my pillow when I missed him too much to sleep. He knew that my biggest fear was ending up in a nursing home, forgotten and alone. All of these intimate details that I'd shared during our courtship, thinking they were building genuine intimacy, had been carefully cataloged for future use against me. The notebook also contained what appeared to be a timeline. Month 1 to 3. Establish trust, create emotional dependency. Month 4 to 6. Gradual financial integration, isolate from family. Month 6 to 9. Legal access to assets, begin transfer process. Month 9 to 12. Exit strategy implementation. We were currently in month 7 of his timeline. But the most chilling discovery was a folder of photographs and documents related to other women, at least 6 of them, all elderly, all widowed, all with substantial assets. Some of the photos showed women I recognized from obituaries in the local newspaper. Women who had died under mysterious circumstances after brief marriages to much younger men. My hands shook as I realized I wasn't Alejandro's first victim. I was just the latest in a long line of lonely widows who had paid the ultimate price for believing in love. The next morning, I called in sick to my volunteer work for the first time in 5 years. Instead, I drove to the public library and spent hours researching everything I could find about marriage fraud, elder abuse, and the legal protections available to victims. What I learned terrified me. In many cases, by the time victims realized they'd been targeted, it was too late. Their assets had been transferred, their families alienated, and their legal options limited. Some victims, like those women in Alejandro's folder, had died before they could seek help. But I also learned something that gave me hope. Knowledge was power, and I still had time to act. I spent the afternoon at the bank, meeting with a financial advisor named Mrs. Chun who specialized in elder protection services. Without revealing the specific details of my situation, I asked hypothetical questions about safeguarding assets and protecting myself from financial abuse. The most important thing, Mrs. Chun said, is to never act alone. Financial predators count on their victims being isolated. They work hard to cut you off from family and friends who might recognize what's happening. Her words hit me like a physical blow. I thought about how Alejandro had gradually discouraged my friendships, how he'd subtly criticized my children until I'd started avoiding their calls, how he'd positioned himself as the only person who truly understood and cared about me. What would you advise someone in a hypothetical situation where they suspected their spouse had ulterior motives? I asked carefully. Mrs. Chun leaned forward, her expression serious. Document everything. Don't confront the suspected abuser directly. That can be dangerous. Build a support network of professionals. And most importantly, remember that it's never too late to protect yourself, no matter how embarrassed or foolish you might feel. As I drove home, my mind was racing with plans. I couldn't confront Alejandro directly, not yet. I needed more evidence, more time to protect myself, and most importantly, I needed to reconnect with my children. That evening, as Alejandro massaged my shoulders and told me about his day, I played the role of the devoted wife while secretly planning my next moves. Every gentle touch felt like a lie. Every "I love you" like a knife in my heart. But I was no longer the naive widow who had fallen for his charms. I was Evangeline Morningstar, daughter of a steel magnate, mother of 3 successful children, and survivor of 60 years of life's ups and downs. I had fought breast cancer, survived the Great Recession, and buried the love of my life with dignity and grace. If Alejandro thought I was just another easy mark, he was about to learn how wrong he was. The next day, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my daughter Patricia. Mom. Her voice was surprised but hopeful. Is everything okay? No, sweetheart, I said. my voice steadier than I felt. It's not, but it's going to be. Can you come over tomorrow while Alejandro is at work? We need to talk. There was a pause then. I'll be there. I love you, Mom. I love you too, baby. More than you know. As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. The strength that comes from family, from knowing you're not alone in the fight ahead. Alejandro had made one crucial mistake in his careful planning. He'd underestimated the power of a mother's love and a family's loyalty. He thought he'd successfully isolated me, but blood runs deeper than manipulation. And I was about to show him just how deep those bonds could go. Patricia arrived at my house the next morning at exactly 10 a.m., just 30 minutes after Alejandro left for what he claimed was a construction job. My daughter looked older than her 35 years, with worry lines around her eyes that reminded me painfully of myself during the hardest times with Harold's illness. She hugged me tighter than she had in months, and I could feel her relief at being welcomed back into my life. Mom, I've been so worried about you, she said, pulling back to study my face. You look tired. Thinner. Are you taking care of yourself? I led her to the kitchen table where Harold and I had made every important decision of our marriage, where we'd helped our children with homework and planned family vacations. It felt like the right place for this conversation. Patricia, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without saying, I told you so, even though you have every right to. Her expression immediately became alert, the same look she'd worn as a child when she knew she was about to hear something important. I told her everything. About the secret phone, the messages, the notebook with my personal information, the folder of other women. I watched my daughter's face cycle through shock, anger, and finally, a determined fury that reminded me of her grandfather. That son of a... She caught herself, remembering she was talking to her mother. Mom, we have to call the police right now. I thought about that, I said, but I researched it. What he's done so far isn't technically illegal. He hasn't stolen anything yet, and we'd have to prove he married me under false pretenses with intent to defraud, which is harder than you'd think. Patricia was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Then she surprised me with a smile that was equal parts loving and devious. You know what, Mom? Maybe it's time he learned that he picked the wrong family to mess with. My daughter, it turned out, had inherited more than just her grandfather's business sense. Patricia worked in cybersecurity for a major corporation, and her husband David was a private investigator who specialized in background checks for high-net-worth individuals. We're going to destroy him, Patricia said with calm certainty. But we're going to do it smart, and we're going to do it legally. The next few days were a whirlwind of careful investigation. David began running comprehensive background checks on Alejandro Rodriguez, which, we discovered, wasn't even his real name. Patricia used her technical skills to trace his digital footprint, while I played the role of the oblivious wife, gathering evidence from inside my own home. What we uncovered was absolutely horrifying. His real name was Anthony Richardson, and he was 28, not 25. He had been married 4 times in the past 6 years, always to wealthy widows between the ages of 55 and 75. 2 of his previous wives had died under suspicious circumstances, one from an apparent fall downstairs, another from what was ruled a heart attack, but had occurred just weeks after she'd changed her will to leave everything to her young husband. The other 2 wives were still alive, but had been left financially devastated. One was now living in a subsidized senior apartment after losing her family home. The other had attempted suicide after discovering her husband's betrayal. Mom, Patricia said, her voice shaking as she showed me the police reports David had obtained. This man isn't just a con artist. We think he might be a killer. The room seemed to spin around me as the full magnitude of my situation became clear. I hadn't just married a liar or a thief. I had potentially invited a predator into my home, into my bed, into my life. What do we do? I whispered, suddenly feeling every one of my 60 years. We build a case, David said grimly. But more importantly, we keep you safe while we do it. The plan they developed was both simple and terrifying. I would continue playing the loving wife while they gathered enough evidence to bring to law enforcement. But I wouldn't be doing it alone. Patricia took a leave of absence from work, claiming she needed to help care for her aging mother. She rented an apartment 10 minutes away and began showing up at my house every day while Alejandro was at work, helping me install hidden cameras and audio recording devices throughout the house. "If he's planning to hurt you," she said, adjusting a tiny camera hidden in the artificial flowers on my mantelpiece, "we're going to have evidence. And if he's just planning to rob you blind, we'll have evidence of that too." Meanwhile, David was building a comprehensive file on Anthony Richardson's criminal activities. He'd connected with investigators from 3 other states and discovered a pattern of suspicious deaths and financial fraud stretching back almost a decade. "This guy is good," David admitted during one of our secret planning sessions. "He changes his name, his appearance, even his accent depending on what his target wants to hear. But he's also gotten sloppy, probably because he's been getting away with it for so long." The hardest part was continuing to live with Alejandro, as if nothing had changed. Every morning when he brought me coffee, I had to smile and thank him, knowing that he was calculating how much my death would be worth to him. Every evening when he rubbed my feet, I had to act relaxed and grateful, when all I wanted to do was run screaming from the house. But I also discovered something I hadn't expected. I was stronger than I'd given myself credit for. Maybe it was the knowledge that my family was supporting me, or maybe it was the righteous anger that burned in my chest every time I thought about his other victims. But playing this dangerous game awakened something in me that had been dormant since Harold's death, a fierce determination to survive and protect others from the same fate. 2 weeks into our surveillance operation, we hit the jackpot. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Alejandro received a phone call on his secret phone. He thought I was too far away to hear, but the recording devices Patricia had installed picked up every word. "Yeah, it's going perfectly," I heard him say. "The old lady is completely under my control. I've got her isolated from her kids, and she's so grateful for the attention she'd sign anything I put in front of her." There was a pause as the person on the other end spoke. "No, not yet," Alejandro continued. "But soon. I'm thinking Christmas might be the perfect time for an accident. Slippery stairs, icy driveway. These old houses are full of hazards for someone her age." My knees almost gave out as I realized he was casually discussing my murder like it was a business transaction. The house alone is worth $800,000, plus she's got about $400,000 in savings and investments. Her late husband had a hefty life insurance policy that transferred to her. I'm looking at well over $1 million once everything's settled. I gripped the kitchen counter so hard my knuckles went white, fighting the urge to march into the living room and confront him with everything I'd learned. But I knew that would be signing my own death warrant. That evening, after Alejandro had gone to bed, I met Patricia and David at an all-night diner across town. The recording device had captured everything, and David's expression was grim as he listened to the playback. "This is enough," he said. "We're taking this to the FBI tomorrow. This crosses state lines, involves multiple victims, and we have clear evidence of intent to commit murder." But Patricia shook her head. "What if they arrest him and he makes bail? What if his lawyer gets the evidence thrown out because of how we obtained it? We need something ironclad, something that protects Mom completely." "What are you suggesting?" I asked. My daughter's eyes held the same determination I'd seen in her father when he was fighting his final battle with cancer. "We're going to give him exactly what he wants," she said. "But on our terms." The plan Patricia outlined was audacious and risky, but it was also brilliant. Instead of trying to stop Alejandro's con, we were going to let him think it was succeeding while we documented everything. We would create a situation where he revealed his true intentions in a way that couldn't be denied or explained away. "He's planning to kill you at Christmas," Patricia said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "That gives us 8 weeks to set our trap." Over the next month, I became the perfect victim for Alejandro's scheme. I started asking him about financial planning, expressing worry about my children's future inheritance, and even mentioning how dangerous my old house was becoming for someone my age. "Maybe you're right about refinancing," I told him one evening, snuggling closer to him on the couch. "And I've been thinking about updating my will. Harold's been gone for 3 years now, and my situation has changed so much." I could practically see the dollar signs in his eyes. "That sounds very wise, mi amor," he said, stroking my hair in a way that now made my skin crawl. "I could help you with that if you'd like. I know a lawyer who specializes in estate planning for seniors." Of course he did. I was willing to bet this lawyer was part of his operation, ready to draft documents that would leave Alejandro perfectly positioned to inherit everything after my convenient accident. "Would you really do that for me?" I asked, injecting my voice with the breathless gratitude he expected. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'll never have to find out," he replied, and the promise sounded like a threat. Meanwhile, Patricia and David were building our case with the help of a FBI agent named Sarah Martinez, who specialized in elder fraud cases. Agent Martinez was impressed with the evidence we'd gathered, but agreed that we needed Alejandro to make a more explicit move before they could arrest him. "He's been doing this for years," she explained during a secret meeting at Patricia's apartment. "He's careful, patient, and he has an excellent lawyer. We need him to either attempt the actual fraud or make a direct threat against your mother's life." "So we wait for him to try to kill me?" I asked, not sure whether to laugh or cry at the absurdity of the situation. "Not exactly," Agent Martinez said. "We're going to create a scenario where he thinks he's succeeded, but where you're completely safe." The plan they developed was worthy of a Hollywood thriller. Patricia would publicly argue with me about my relationship with Alejandro, making it seem like our family rift was widening. I would become increasingly isolated and dependent on my husband. Then, just before Christmas, I would stage a situation that would give Alejandro the perfect opportunity to implement his accident plan, while federal agents and my family watched and recorded everything. It was dangerous. It was complicated. And it was absolutely terrifying. But as I looked around that table at my daughter, my son-in-law, and the federal agent who was risking her career to help protect me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Alejandro had made one fatal error in his careful planning. He'd assumed that a 60-year-old widow would be helpless, isolated, and easy to manipulate. He'd never considered that I came from a family of fighters, or that my children's love for me was stronger than any wedge he could drive between us. He wanted to play games? Fine. But he was about to discover that in this particular game, I held all the cards. And I was prepared to play them all. The plot thickens. Evangeline is no longer the helpless victim Alejandro thinks she is. But can she really pull off this dangerous plan without putting herself in mortal danger? And what happens when a predator realizes he's become the prey? Hit like if you're on the edge of your seat, and subscribe to see how this grandmother turns the tables on her would-be killer. December arrived with a bitter cold that seemed to seep into my bones, but it had nothing on the chill I felt every time Alejandro touched me. Living with someone who was planning your murder while pretending to be the perfect husband required a level of acting I never knew I possessed. But I was getting better at it every day. "Evangeline, you seem distant lately," Alejandro said one morning as he brought me coffee in bed, a ritual that once felt romantic, but now felt like a countdown to my execution. "Is everything all right, mi amor?" I looked up at him. This man who had infiltrated my life with deadly precision and forced tears into my eyes. "I'm just feeling so isolated lately. Patricia and I had another fight yesterday about you, and I'm starting to wonder if my children will ever accept our marriage." It wasn't entirely an act. The staged arguments Patricia and I had been having for the benefit of his surveillance were taking an emotional toll, even though we both knew they were necessary. "What did she say this time?" he asked, sitting on the edge of the bed with an expression of concerned sympathy that would have fooled me completely 6 weeks ago. "She accused you of being a gold digger again," I said, letting my voice break slightly. "She said I was being stupid and naive, and that I was going to end up broke and alone because of you." Alejandro's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression I'd learned to watch for during my crash course in detecting deception. "I'm sorry she's putting you through this," he said, pulling me into his arms. "But you know the truth, don't you? You know how much I love you." "Of course I do," I whispered against his chest, breathing in the cologne that had once made my heart race and now made my stomach turn. "I just wish there was a way to prove to them that you're not what they think you are." I felt his body relax slightly, and I knew I'd said exactly what he wanted to hear. Maybe there is, he said thoughtfully. What if we did something that showed them how committed I am to our future together? Something that proved I'm not going anywhere. And there it was, the opening we'd been waiting for. What do you mean? I asked, pulling back to look at him with wide, hopeful eyes. Well, he said, stroking my cheek with false tenderness, I've been thinking about what you said about updating your will. Maybe if your children saw that you were making smart financial decisions for our future together, they'd realize I'm not just some fortune hunter. My heart pounded, but I kept my expression innocent and hopeful. What kind of decisions? Simple things, he said with practiced casualness. Putting the house in both our names for tax purposes. Setting up a joint trust. Making sure that if something happens to you, I can take care of everything the way you'd want it handled. There it was. The trap was being set, and he thought I was walking straight into it. That sounds wonderful, I said, letting relief flood my voice. But wouldn't that be expensive? All those legal fees? Don't worry about that, Alejandro said, and I caught the flash of excitement in his eyes that he couldn't quite hide. I told you I know a lawyer who specializes in this kind of thing. He owes me a favor, so he'll do it for almost nothing. Of course he would. I was willing to bet this lawyer had helped facilitate the theft of every other victim's assets. When could we do this? I asked, playing the eager bride perfectly. How about next week? Before Christmas. It would be like an early Christmas gift to ourselves, securing our future together. I agreed with enthusiasm that made me sick to my stomach, and Alejandro kissed me with passion that felt like poison on my lips. As soon as he left for work, I called the emergency number Agent Martinez had given me. He's making his move, I reported. Next week, he wants to take me to his lawyer to sign documents putting everything in joint ownership. Perfect, Agent Martinez said. We'll be ready. The plan that emerged from our emergency meeting was elegantly simple. I would go to the lawyer's appointment as scheduled, but Patricia would follow at a distance, and Agent Martinez would be monitoring from a surveillance van outside. Hidden recording devices would capture everything that happened in the lawyer's office. But more importantly, David had discovered something that changed everything. Anthony Richardson's lawyer was already under federal investigation for his role in a massive elder fraud scheme operating across 5 states. Our case against Alejandro was about to become part of a much larger takedown. The timing couldn't be better, Agent Martinez explained. We've been trying to get enough evidence to arrest Richard Morrison, that's the lawyer's real name, for months. Your husband just handed us the perfect opportunity. The days leading up to the appointment crawled by like months. Every interaction with Alejandro felt like walking through a minefield. He was becoming more affectionate and attentive, probably sensing that his payday was approaching. The irony wasn't lost on me. The closer he got to what he thought was victory, the sweeter he became. I've been thinking, he said the night before our lawyer's appointment, maybe after we get the paperwork sorted out, we should take a little vacation. Somewhere warm, romantic. We could go to that bed and breakfast in the mountains you mentioned. I knew exactly which bed and breakfast he meant. The one I told him about during one of our early conversations, where Harold and I had celebrated our 25th anniversary. The same bed and breakfast where one of his previous victims had died in a mysterious fall down a flight of stairs. That sounds lovely, I managed to say through the terror that was threatening to overwhelm me. And maybe, he continued, his hand finding mine in the darkness, maybe it's time you stopped taking those blood pressure medications. You've been doing so well lately, and I worry about you taking too many pills. My blood pressure medication. The medication that kept my heart condition stable. The medication that, if I stopped taking it, could cause a fatal heart attack within days. I understood now how his previous victims had died. Not from dramatic accidents, but from subtle medical sabotage that would look like natural causes to anyone who wasn't looking closely. You might be right, I said, squeezing his hand while my mind raced. I'll talk to Dr. Peterson about reducing my dosage. I felt him relax beside me, satisfied that his suggestion had been accepted. He had no idea that Dr. Peterson was already part of our team, having been briefed by Agent Martinez about the need to protect me from medical manipulation. The next morning dawned gray and cold, with the kind of bitter wind that cuts right through your coat. As I got dressed for what I knew might be the most important performance of my life, I caught sight of myself in Harold's mirror. The woman looking back at me was different from the lonely widow who had met Alejandro 8 months earlier. My eyes were clearer, my posture straighter, my expression more determined. Somewhere in the process of uncovering my husband's lies, I had rediscovered my own strength. "You can do this, Evie," I whispered to my reflection, using Harold's pet name for me. "You've survived worse than this." Alejandro was unusually quiet during the drive to the lawyer's office, but I could sense his barely contained excitement. He kept glancing at me with what I now recognized as predatory satisfaction, like a cat who had finally cornered a mouse. "Are you nervous?" he asked as we pulled into the parking lot of a shabby office building downtown. "A little," I admitted, which was the understatement of the century. "But excited too. It feels like we're really building a life together." He squeezed my hand, and I had to fight not to pull away from his touch. The lawyer's office was exactly what I'd expected. Cheap furniture, outdated diplomas on the walls, and the kind of desperate atmosphere that suggested this man would do anything for money. Richard Morrison was a thin, nervous man in his 50s with the kind of shifty eyes that never quite met yours directly. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said, standing to greet me. "Anthony has told me so much about you. Please have a seat." As we settled into the uncomfortable chairs across from his desk, I noticed the documents were already prepared and waiting for my signature. Red flag number 1. Any legitimate lawyer would have wanted to discuss my wishes before drafting legal documents. "Now then," Morrison said, sliding the papers across his desk, "Anthony has explained that you want to ensure your financial future together is secure. These documents will establish joint ownership of all marital assets and create a trust that will protect your wealth from any future challenges." I picked up the first document and pretended to read it carefully, though Patricia had already explained exactly what these papers would do: transfer ownership of my house, my savings, and my investments to Alejandro, while making me financially dependent on his goodwill. "This all looks very thorough," I said admiringly. "You must be an excellent lawyer." Morrison preened at the compliment, clearly not used to positive feedback. "I do take pride in protecting my clients' interests." "I'm sure all your clients appreciate that," I continued innocently. "Alejandro mentioned you've helped other couples in similar situations." I saw Alejandro stiffen slightly, but Morrison was already nodding. "Oh yes, many times. Older women marrying younger men face unique legal challenges, but I've developed effective strategies over the years." "How many couples would you say you've helped?" I pressed, ignoring Alejandro's warning look. "Dozens," Morrison said proudly. "Though sadly, many of my female clients have passed away before they could see the full benefits of our planning. Age catches up with all of us eventually." The casual way he discussed the deaths of the women he'd helped defraud made my blood boil, but I maintained my sweet, naive expression. "Well, hopefully I have many years left to enjoy our marriage," I said, picking up the pen he offered me. "I'm sure you do," Morrison replied, but something in his tone suggested he thought otherwise. As I pretended to sign the first document, I thought about all the women who had sat in this same chair, signing their lives away to men who saw them as nothing more than bank accounts with heartbeats. I thought about the widow in Florida who had jumped from her apartment balcony after discovering her husband's betrayal. I thought about the grandmother in Arizona who had died alone in a hospital while her young husband liquidated her assets. But most of all, I thought about the hidden cameras recording every word, the FBI agents listening to every admission of guilt, and my daughter waiting in the parking lot to make sure I walked out of this office alive. When I finished signing the fake documents, Patricia had prepared identical papers with slightly different wording that would be legally meaningless. Morrison stood up with obvious satisfaction. "Congratulations," he said, shaking both our hands. "You're now legally protected against any future financial uncertainty." What he meant, of course, was that Alejandro was now legally positioned to steal everything I owned. As we walked to the car, Alejandro was practically vibrating with excitement. "How do you feel, mi amor? Better about our future?" "Much better," I said, though what I really felt was relief that phase one of our counter-operation was complete. That evening, Alejandro was more attentive than he'd been in weeks. He cooked my favorite meal, opened a bottle of expensive wine, and spent the entire dinner talking about our future together, trips we'd take, improvements we'd make to the house, the comfortable retirement we'd enjoy. Every word was a lie, and we both knew it, but only one of us knew that the other knew. "I have a surprise for you," he said as we finished dessert. "Remember that bed and breakfast you told me about? The one in the mountains where you and Harold celebrated your anniversary?" My heart stopped. "The Pinecrest Inn? That's the one. I made reservations for Christmas week. I thought it would be the perfect place for us to celebrate our first Christmas as a married couple." The perfect place for my accident, he meant. The same place where Helen Morrison, no relation to the lawyer, had died in a suspicious fall just 2 years earlier, shortly after marrying a much younger man who had mysteriously disappeared after her funeral. "That's wonderful," I said, hoping my voice didn't betray the terror I felt. "But isn't it expensive during the holidays?" "Don't worry about that," Alejandro said, reaching across to caress my cheek. "Money won't be a problem much longer." That night, as I lay in bed listening to Alejandro's steady breathing, I made peace with what I had to do. In 6 days, I would climb into a car with a man who was planning to kill me, drive to a remote mountain inn, and trust that my family and the FBI could protect me from becoming another tragic statistic. It was the most terrifying thing I'd ever contemplated, but it was also the only way to ensure that Alejandro never hurt another innocent woman. I thought about Harold and how proud he would have been to see me fighting back instead of giving up. I thought about my children and how this experience had brought us closer together than we'd been in years. And I thought about all the women who had died because no one had been there to protect them. Tomorrow, the real game would begin. And this time, I wasn't playing to lose. The trap is set, but at what cost? Evangeline is about to walk into the lion's den with only her wits and her family's love to protect her. Will their plan work, or has she signed her own death warrant? Like and subscribe if your heart is racing, because next week's chapter will determine whether our brave grandmother becomes a victim or a victor. Christmas Eve morning arrived with a fresh snowfall that blanketed our neighborhood in pristine white. Any other year, I would have found it beautiful. Today, it looked like a shroud. I stood at my bedroom window, watching Alejandro load our suitcases into his car, and fought down the panic that had been my constant companion for the past week. In my purse was a small GPS tracker that David had given me, disguised as a pill case. Sewn into the lining of my coat was a tiny recording device that would transmit everything to the FBI surveillance team that would be following us at a distance. But none of that technology would help me if Alejandro decided to accelerate his timeline. "Ready for our romantic getaway, mi amor?" he asked when he came back inside, his smile bright enough to power the Christmas tree in our living room. "Ready as I'll ever be," I replied, and it was the truest thing I'd said to him in weeks. The drive to the Pinecrest Inn normally took 3 hours, but with the snow, Alejandro estimated it would take closer to 4. 4 hours alone in a car with a man who was planning my death. 4 hours to maintain my performance while my family and the FBI coordinated the most important operation of all our lives. For the first hour, Alejandro was charming and talkative, pointing out Christmas decorations in the towns we passed and sharing stories about Christmas traditions in Spain that I now knew were completely fabricated. His good mood was infectious in the most terrifying way possible, the enthusiasm of a predator approaching the kill. "I have something special planned for tonight," he said as we wound through mountain roads that became increasingly isolated with each mile. "Something that will make this Christmas unforgettable." "What kind of something?" I asked, proud of how steady my voice sounded. "You'll see," he said, reaching over to pat my knee. "But I promise you, after tonight, you'll never have to worry about anything ever again." The threat was barely veiled now, and I wondered if the recording device was picking up the sinister undertone in his voice. As we climbed higher into the mountains, my phone lost signal completely. I was now entirely dependent on the GPS tracker and the FBI team's ability to follow us without being detected. The snow was falling heavier now, making the roads treacherous and the landscape look like something from a horror movie. beautiful, isn't it? Alejandro said, gesturing at the wilderness surrounding us. So peaceful. So isolated. A person could disappear up here and never be found. I forced myself to laugh. Don't be morbid, darling. It's Christmas Eve. You're right, he said, but his smile had taken on a quality that made my skin crawl. I shouldn't talk about disappearing. Not when we have so much to look forward to. The Pinecrest Inn appeared through the snow like something from a fairy tale, a massive log structure with warm lights glowing in every window and smoke curling from multiple chimneys. Under different circumstances, it would have been the perfect romantic getaway. Today, it felt like the setting for my own murder. Alejandro was the perfect gentleman as we checked in, charming the elderly desk clerk and insisting on carrying our bags himself. He'd reserved the honeymoon suite on the 3rd floor, the same floor where Helen Morrison had died, I realized with a chill. The view from up there is spectacular, the desk clerk said as she handed us our keys. Though I should warn you, some of the stairs can be a bit slippery when people track in snow. We've had a few accidents over the years. We'll be very careful, Alejandro said solemnly, but I caught the meaningful look he gave the stairs as we passed them. Our suite was beautiful, a massive 4-poster bed, a fireplace already crackling with warmth, and huge windows that looked out over the snow-covered valley below. There was also a large balcony with a hot tub, accessible through French doors that looked original to the building and probably didn't have the most secure locks. It's perfect, I said, setting my purse carefully on the dresser where the GPS tracker would have the best chance of transmitting our location. It really is, Alejandro agreed, but he was looking at me, not the room, and something in his expression made my blood freeze. We spent the afternoon exploring the inn and the small tourist town nearby, playing the part of the happy couple for anyone who might later be questioned about our visit. Alejandro bought me hot chocolate at a local cafe and insisted on taking selfies of us together, pictures that would probably be used to establish our presence here when my accident was investigated. But as evening approached, I noticed subtle changes in his behavior. He became more possessive, keeping his hand on my arm or back constantly. He suggested we skip the inn's Christmas Eve dinner and order room service instead. He started asking odd questions about my medical history and my current medications. You mentioned you sometimes get dizzy spells, he said as we returned to our room after dinner. Are you feeling all right tonight? You look a little pale. I hadn't mentioned any dizzy spells, but I played along. I am feeling a bit lightheaded. Maybe it's the altitude. Why don't you take a nice hot bath, he suggested. I'll make us some hot toddies to warm us up. A hot bath in a slippery tub, combined with alcohol and my dizzy spells, it would be the perfect setup for a tragic accident. I agreed enthusiastically, while mentally preparing for what I knew was coming. As I ran the bath water, I heard Alejandro on the phone in the next room, his voice too low for me to make out the words. But the tone was businesslike, efficient, the voice of a man finalizing plans. I locked the bathroom door and sat on the edge of the tub, fully clothed, while the water ran. Through the tiny window, I could see the lights of what I hoped was Agent Martinez's surveillance van in the parking lot below. Evangeline, Alejandro called softly. I have your drink ready. Just a minute, I called back, flushing the toilet to buy more time while I tried to steady my nerves. When I emerged from the bathroom 20 minutes later, Alejandro was sitting on the bed with 2 steaming mugs and an expression of such false concern that it was almost comical. Feeling better? He asked. Much, thank you. I accepted the mug he offered, noting how eagerly he watched me raise it to my lips. The drink smelled normal, rum, honey, lemon, but I trusted nothing he gave me now. I pretended to take a sip while actually just wetting my lips, then set the mug aside. Not thirsty? He asked, and I detected the first note of impatience in his voice. I'm saving it, I said. Maybe we could drink them out on the balcony? Under the stars? Something flickered in his eyes. Excitement, anticipation. That's a wonderful idea. The hot tub is already warmed up. Of course it was. A late-night soak in the hot tub, with alcohol and whatever he'd put in my drink, followed by a tragic slip on the icy balcony floor. Another grieving young widower, another mysterious accident, another perfect crime. Except this time, his perfect victim knew exactly what was coming. "Let me just freshen up first," I said, heading back toward the bathroom. "And maybe you could light some candles? Make it romantic?" As soon as the bathroom door closed behind me, I pulled out the emergency phone Patricia had given me and sent a single text. "Now." Then I sat down on the bathroom floor and waited for my life to change forever. I stayed in that bathroom for exactly 12 minutes. Long enough for the FBI team to get into position, but not so long that Alejandro would become suspicious. When I emerged, he had indeed lit candles around the room, creating an atmosphere that should have been romantic, but felt more like a funeral parlor. "Perfect timing," he said, moving toward me with predatory grace. "I was just about to come check on you." The balcony doors were already open, letting in the bitter mountain air. I could see the hot tub steaming in the darkness, surrounded by a decorative stone ledge that would be treacherous when wet. Everything was set up for my accident. "It's beautiful out there," I said, moving toward the balcony with what I hoped looked like eager anticipation rather than terror. "Wait," Alejandro said, catching my arm. "Your drink. You should finish it first for warmth." He pressed the mug into my hands, and this time his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. There was something harder there now, more focused. The mask was starting to slip. "Of course," I said, raising the mug to my lips again. This time, I allowed a small amount of the liquid to touch my tongue before pretending to swallow. It tasted normal, but there was a slight bitter aftertaste that confirmed my suspicions about what he'd added to it. "All of it," he said, and now his voice carried clear authority. "It's cold out there. You need to stay warm." This was the moment. I could either drink what was almost certainly a drugged beverage and hope the FBI would save me before I died, or I could take control of my own fate. I chose the latter. "You know what, Alejandro?" I said, setting the mug down on the dresser with deliberate care. "I think we need to talk." His expression shifted immediately, the loving husband facade cracking like ice. "Talk about what, mi amor?" "About Anthony Richardson," I said, watching his face go pale. "About Helen Morrison and Margaret Chen and all the other women whose trust you violated." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the crackling of the fireplace and the distant sound of wind through the trees. Then Alejandro began to laugh, a cold, cruel sound that bore no resemblance to the warm laughter I'd fallen in love with. Well, he said, his accent completely gone now, replaced by flat, emotionless American English. The old bird figured it out. I wondered how long that would take. The transformation was complete and terrifying. Gone was the charming young husband who brought me coffee and massaged my feet. In his place stood a stranger whose eyes held nothing but calculating coldness. "How long have you known?" he asked, moving closer to me with the fluid grace of a predator. "Long enough," I said, backing toward the balcony doors. "Long enough to make sure you'll never hurt another woman the way you've hurt me." "Hurt you?" He laughed again. "Evangeline, I gave you 8 months of happiness. 8 months of feeling desired and loved. That's more than most women your age get. You should be grateful." "Grateful?" The word came out as a snarl. "You destroyed my relationship with my children. You violated my trust. You made me question everything I believed about love and hope and human decency. And in return," he said, still advancing, "I was going to give you a quick, painless death. Much more merciful than the long, lonely decline you were facing. Really, when you think about it, I was doing you a favor." I had reached the balcony doors now, the cold mountain air hitting my back like a slap. Below us, I could see the lights of the parking lot, but I couldn't tell if the FBI was in position yet. "The only problem," Alejandro continued, reaching into his jacket, "is that now you know too much. Which means your death can't look like an accident anymore." When his hand emerged, it was holding a small revolver that gleamed in the candlelight. "That's the trouble with you old ladies," he said, his voice taking on a conversational tone that was somehow more terrifying than if he'd been shouting. "You always think you're smarter than you actually are. You think your age gives you wisdom, but really it just makes you slow and easy to fool." "Maybe," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the fear coursing through my veins. But it also teaches you a few things about survival. That's when I did something that surprised both of us. I smiled. What could you possibly have to smile about? He demanded, the gun wavering slightly in his grip. Well, I said, for starters, I didn't actually sign those documents this afternoon. His confidence flickered for the first time. What are you talking about? Patricia, my daughter, the one you've been so carefully turning me against, she's a cybersecurity expert. She helped me forge a set of fake papers with different terms. The ones I signed today won't hold up in any court. You're lying, he said, but uncertainty was creeping into his voice. And David, my son-in-law, is a private investigator. He's been building a file on Anthony Richardson for weeks now. Did you know the FBI has been looking for you in connection with at least 6 suspicious deaths? Now the gun was shaking in his hand, and his face had gone from confident to panicked. But here's my favorite part, I continued, pulling my phone from my pocket. This entire conversation has been broadcast live to Agent Sarah Martinez of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who is currently in the parking lot with a team of agents. Alejandro spun toward the window, and that's when we both saw them, dark shapes moving through the snow, surrounding the building with military precision. You manipulative old witch, he snarled, turning the gun toward me with deadly intent. But before he could pull the trigger, the balcony doors behind me exploded inward as FBI agents in tactical gear swarmed into the room. FBI, drop your weapon. What followed was a chaos of shouting voices, blinding flashlights, and the sound of Alejandro's gun clattering across the floor as agents tackled him to the ground. I found myself pulled away from the confrontation and into the protective arms of Agent Martinez, who had appeared as if from nowhere. Are you hurt? She asked, her hands checking me for injuries while her eyes remained fixed on the scene unfolding across the room. No, I managed to say, though my legs felt like jelly. No, I'm okay. As they handcuffed Alejandro and read him his rights, he looked at me with such hatred that I actually stepped backward. Gone was any pretense of the man I'd thought I'd married. This was his true face, cold, vicious, and utterly without remorse. This isn't over, he hissed as they dragged him toward the door. You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. Actually, Agent Martinez said calmly, it is over. We've been building a case against your entire operation for months. Your lawyer Richard Morrison was arrested an hour ago, along with 3 other members of your fraud ring. Your little black book of victims has given us enough evidence to put you away for the rest of your natural life. The look of shock on Alejandro's face was almost worth 8 months of terror and humiliation. As they led him away, Patricia burst into the room like an avenging angel, her face streaked with tears as she pulled me into the tightest hug of my life. Mom, oh God, Mom, are you okay? We heard everything through the wire, and I thought, when we saw him pull that gun. I'm fine, sweetheart, I said, holding my daughter close and breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. I'm fine. But as I said the words, I realized they weren't entirely true. I wasn't fine. I was something much better than fine. I was alive, I was strong, and I was surrounded by people who loved me enough to risk everything to protect me. Mrs. Rodriguez, Agent Martinez said gently, I need to ask you a few questions about what happened tonight, but first, there's something you should know. She led me to a chair by the fireplace, while Patricia held my hand and David appeared with a blanket that he wrapped around my shoulders. The investigation into your husband's activities has uncovered evidence linking him to the deaths of at least 8 elderly women across 5 states, she continued. Your bravery tonight hasn't just saved your own life. It's likely prevented him from claiming more victims and brought justice for women who died thinking they were alone and forgotten. The weight of that revelation hit me like a physical blow. 8 women. 8 grandmothers, wives, mothers who had trusted the wrong person and paid with their lives. What happens now? I asked. Now, Agent Martinez said with satisfaction, Anthony Richardson, whose real name, by the way, is Anthony Kowalski, goes to prison for a very long time. The evidence we've gathered tonight, combined with what we've collected over the past months, makes this case ironclad. He'll be charged with multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and murder. As we gave our statements to investigators and prepared to leave the inn that had been intended as my tomb, I felt something shifting inside me. The scared, lonely widow who had fallen for Alejandro's lies was gone, replaced by someone stronger and more determined. "Mom," Patricia said as we walked to her car, "I'm so sorry. For not supporting you, for making you feel like you couldn't come to us when things got scary, for letting pride keep our family apart when you needed us most." I stopped walking and turned to face my daughter, this brilliant, fierce woman who had risked everything to save me. "You have nothing to apologize for," I said firmly. "You tried to warn me, and I wasn't ready to listen. But when I finally asked for help, you didn't hesitate. You moved heaven and earth to protect me." "We all did," David added, appearing beside us with my suitcase. "Family protects family. That's what Harold always said." As we drove back down the mountain, leaving the scene of Alejandro's downfall behind us, I thought about Harold and how he would have handled this situation. He probably would have seen through Alejandro's lies from the beginning, would have protected me from ever having to go through this ordeal. But maybe I realized going through it myself had taught me something valuable. Maybe I needed to discover my own strength, to learn that even at 60, I was capable of fighting for myself and others. The snow had stopped falling, and through the car window, I could see stars beginning to peek through the clouds. They reminded me of the night Harold proposed, when he'd told me that our love would last longer than the stars themselves. He'd been right about that. Our love had lasted, had sustained me through the darkest period of my life and given me the strength to find my way back to the light. But now I was also discovering that there were different kinds of love worth fighting for. The love of family that never gives up, the love of justice that demands action, and perhaps most importantly, the love of self that refuses to be diminished by others' cruelty. As we descended into the valley, heading home for Christmas morning with my family, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement about the future. Christmas miracle. Evangeline has survived the worst night of her life and brought down a dangerous predator in the process. But how will she rebuild her life after such a devastating betrayal? And what lessons can we all learn from her incredible courage? Don't miss the final chapter. Like and subscribe to see how this remarkable woman reclaims her power. 6 months have passed since that terrifying Christmas Eve, and I'm sitting in my backyard garden watching my granddaughter Emma help me plant new roses where Harold's old ones used to be. The spring sunshine is warm on my face, and for the first time in almost a year, I feel truly at peace. The trial was a media sensation, though I tried to stay out of the spotlight as much as possible. Anthony Kowalski, I refuse to call him by the false name he used to seduce me, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His lawyer, Richard Morrison, received 25 years for his role in the fraud ring that had stolen millions from elderly victims across the country. But the real victory wasn't just in their convictions. During the investigation, authorities were able to recover assets stolen from other victims and shut down an entire network of criminals who had been targeting vulnerable seniors for years. "Grandma Evie," Emma says, looking up at me with soil-covered hands and a gap-toothed grin, "why did you want to plant new roses instead of keeping Grandpa Harold's old ones?" It's a good question, and one that goes to the heart of everything I've learned over these past months. Because, sweetheart, I say, helping her pat soil around the roots of a particularly beautiful red rose bush, sometimes the old plants get diseased, and you have to remove them to make room for new growth. These new roses will be just as beautiful as the old ones, but they'll be healthier and stronger. She nods seriously, as if this makes perfect sense, then goes back to her digging. The truth is, I've learned that healing isn't about pretending the bad things never happened or trying to go back to the way things were before. It's about acknowledging the damage, learning from it, and choosing to grow anyway. My relationship with my children has been transformed by our shared experience. Patricia and I are closer now than we've been since she was a teenager. Robert, who flew in from Seattle the moment he heard what had happened, has started calling me twice a week just to check in. And Marcus has begun bringing his own children over every Sunday for family dinner, a tradition Harold and I started, but that had fallen by the wayside after his death. You know what the best part of all this is? Patricia said last week as we sat on my front porch, watching her kids play in the yard. Seeing you come back to yourself. You're different now than you were before Alejandro, but in good ways. Stronger. More confident. She was right. The experience of being targeted, manipulated, and ultimately fighting back had awakened something in me that I thought was lost forever, a sense of purpose and agency that had nothing to do with being someone's wife or mother or grandmother. I've started volunteering with a local organization that helps elder abuse victims navigate the legal system and rebuild their lives. My story has become part of their training materials, helping other women recognize the warning signs I missed and showing them that survival and recovery are possible. Last month, I received a letter from Margaret Chin, the widow in Oregon who had lost everything to one of Anthony's associates. She had seen my story on the news and wanted to thank me for giving her hope. I thought I was the only one foolish enough to fall for such an obvious scam, she wrote. Seeing your courage in fighting back has inspired me to pursue justice for what was done to me. I'm no longer ashamed. I'm angry, and anger is much more useful than shame. Reading her letter, I felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with my children's accomplishments or my late husband's legacy. This was something I had done, something I had fought for, and won. The house feels different now, too. Not because I've removed all traces of what happened. I've learned that running from painful memories only gives them more power, but because I've reclaimed it as my own space. I had all the locks changed, of course, and installed a security system that makes Patricia feel better about me living alone. But more importantly, I've filled it with new memories. Dorothy comes over for coffee twice a week now, and we laugh about how Alejandro used to discourage our friendship. I never liked that boy, she says every time, conveniently forgetting that she'd initially thought he was charming. Something about his eyes. Too cold for a man who claimed to be in love. I've also started dating again, which shocks everyone who knows my story. Not seriously. I'm not sure I'll ever be ready for another serious relationship, but I've accepted dinner invitations from 2 different gentlemen from my church, and last week I even went dancing with a retired teacher named Frank, who makes me laugh until my sides hurt. Aren't you afraid? Patricia asked when I told her about Frank. After everything that happened? Terrified, I admitted. But I refused to let Anthony's cruelty rob me of the possibility of companionship or joy. Fear is just another kind of prison, and I've spent enough time locked up. The difference now is that I trust my instincts. When Frank tells me about his late wife, I listen not just with my heart but with my head, watching for inconsistencies or signs of manipulation. When he offers to help with my finances or suggests changes to my routine, I pay attention to whether his suggestions serve my interests or his own. I've also learned to value my independence in ways I never did before. I make my own financial decisions now. With advice from professionals, I choose myself. I maintain my own friendships and hobbies without feeling like I need permission or approval. I've even started taking art classes at the community college, something I'd always wanted to do, but never made time for. But perhaps the most important change is in how I see myself. For most of my adult life, I define myself in relation to others, as Harold's wife, as my children's mother, as someone's caregiver or supporter. The experience with Alejandro forced me to discover who Evangeline Morningstar was when she was just herself, standing alone. What I found surprised me. I'm braver than I thought. I'm smarter than I gave myself credit for. And I'm worthy of respect and honesty, not because of what I can provide to others, but simply because I'm a human being with inherent dignity and value. You know what I'm most proud of? I tell Emma as we finish planting the last rose bush. I'm proud that I didn't let him win. He wanted to make me feel small and helpless and ashamed, but instead, I fought back and helped protect other people. Emma considers this seriously, the way children do when they're trying to understand adult concepts. Like a superhero? She asks. Exactly like a superhero, I say, laughing at the comparison. A grandmother superhero. She grins at this idea, clearly delighted by the thought of having a superhero grandmother. As evening approaches and my family gathers for our weekly Sunday dinner, I look around my dining room table at the faces I love most in the world. Patricia is helping her youngest son with his napkin while discussing a work project with David. Robert is showing Marcus something on his phone while his wife, Sarah, serves dessert. The room is full of laughter and conversation and the comfortable chaos of a family that has weathered storms together. This is what Alejandro never understood, and what men like him will never understand. He saw my love for my family as a weakness to be exploited, not realizing that it was actually the source of my greatest strength. During the investigation, Agent Martinez told me something that has stayed with me ever since. Predators like Anthony succeed because they're patient and they're skilled at reading people's vulnerabilities. But they almost always underestimate the power of family bonds and community support. Your strength didn't come from being suspicious or cynical. It came from having people who loved you enough to fight for you. As I sit here now, surrounded by the people who matter most to me, I understand what she meant. My mistake wasn't in being too trusting or too hopeful. It was in forgetting that I didn't have to face life's challenges alone. Before everyone leaves tonight, Robert pulls me aside in the kitchen where we used to have our most important conversations when he was growing up. "Mom," he says, "I owe you an apology. Not just for how I handled the situation with Alejandro, but for not being more present in your life after Dad died. I was so caught up in my own grief that I forgot you were grieving too, and that loneliness made you vulnerable to someone like him." "Oh, sweetheart," I say, reaching up to touch his cheek the way I did when he was small. "We all handled Harold's death the best way we knew how. The important thing is that when it mattered, when I really needed you, you were there." "We'll always be there," he says firmly. "That's a promise." As my family says their goodbyes and heads home through the spring evening, I walk through my house and feel truly at home for the first time since Harold died. Not because I've erased the memory of what happened with Alejandro, but because I've integrated that experience into my story without letting it define me. I am Evangeline Morningstar. I am 78 years old, and I have survived betrayal, terror, and the darkest kind of human cruelty. I have fought back against injustice and won. I have rebuilt relationships that were damaged and discovered strengths I never knew I possessed. I am not a victim. I am not a cautionary tale. I am not someone to be pitied or protected. I am a woman who refused to be defeated, and that makes all the difference. Tomorrow, I'll wake up in my own bed, in my own house, surrounded by my own choices and my own possibilities. I'll tend to the new roses that are already beginning to bloom, call my children because I want to hear their voices, and maybe even call Frank to see if he'd like to join me for dinner and a movie. I'll live my life fully and fearlessly, the way Harold would have wanted me to, the way my children deserve to see me live, and most importantly, the way I deserve to live. Because if surviving Anthony Kowalski taught me anything, it's that life is too short and too precious to waste on fear, regret, or the opinions of people who don't have your best interests at heart. I am 78 years old, and my story is far from over. In fact, I have a feeling the best chapters are still to come. And that knowledge fills me with more joy than any false romance ever could. The roses Harold and I planted together may be gone, but new ones are growing in their place, stronger, more resilient, and more beautiful than ever before. Just like me. What an incredible journey. From lonely widow to fierce survivor, Evangeline's story proves that it's never too late to reclaim your power and rewrite your story. If her courage inspired you, like this video and subscribe for more incredible real-life stories of triumph over adversity. And remember, no matter what age you are, no matter what you've been through, you have the strength to rise again.